Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Schmidt List. I am your host, Kurt Schmidt. Today, we're going to be talking about all things leadership with one of my favorite leadership experts, Ben. He's joining us today. And I've had a lot of folks, especially people in the solopreneur and agency world, really enjoying the idea of sort of planning out their future and vision casting. It's just been a lot of fun working with these people and getting the feedback on the book. So, more to come with that. You can see and you'll find stuff in the description below. Okay, so let's jump in and meet my friend Ben.
Happy to be here and chat with you again. Always enjoy our conversations.
Yes, I always enjoy our conversations as well. I learn so much. So, speaking of learning, let's tell the audience what is it the work you do and who do you work with, Ben?
Yeah, so the short version is that I like to say I'm a leadership development consultant. I work with a lot of leaders from a lot of different types of organizations, and I really just help maximize their ability to be better leaders. And that's with individuals all the way up through to larger organizations with leadership programs, leadership coaching. I'm a Gallup certified Clifton Strengths coach. So there's a piece of that I use as well. So that's kind of the short version of the work I do within the world of leadership.
That's fantastic. One thing I want to talk to you about today specifically is the generation gap in leadership going on right now. We've got people in their upper 60s and 70s. We've got presidents who are in their 80s. We've got this new emerging group of Gen Z moving into their 20s and taking on leadership roles. You have millennials aging into bigger, broader roles. And then you've got Generation Alpha hot on the heels. Are you seeing any differences between the different age groups that you coach in the challenges that they face?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the things that we see with challenges with people, there are universal challenges that are out there, right? Like people want to be respected. People want to be treated well. People want a leader who doesn't just stomp all over them, regardless of what age there is, right? I think one of the differences that you start seeing when you start looking at different leadership approaches and how people respond to different leadership approaches is where that generational gap comes in. For example, the loyalty factor with, if you go up to baby boomers,
Yeah.
they were loyal, right? They wouldn't disappear
They put up
very
with a lot.
quickly. They put up with a lot, right? And they like to be recognized for that loyalty, experience, and expertise. And when you go down younger and younger, whether it's Gen Alpha, Gen Z, whatever the generations are that you want to look at, younger than the baby boomers as an example, they tend to be less patient with those kinds of experiences, tend to view their role as being very intertwined with life, right? Life and purpose being almost more important than longevity in a specific place. So if you aren't tying that together in your workplace, it becomes really challenging. And of course, the flip side of that is that because that loyalty factor isn't there as much, or because that same idea of what it takes to be successful isn't there, you are seeing a lot of younger people moving on from workplaces. It's not, what for many different reasons. And
They're not
of
sticking
course,
around for 15 years.
exactly. We could talk about some of the good reasons they might be moving on for, and potentially sometimes they leave for maybe reasons that we wouldn't understand.
Yeah, there's this old Jack Welch sort of approach to business that is still resonant in the world. But, thankfully, a lot of the tech companies that have taken over kind of threw that book away, whereas still a lot of old school sort of businesses still kind of follow that very top down hierarchical sort of approach to how they manage the human capital in their business. And some people that are kind of old school, they have that sort of feeling. But then, to your point, there is a pendulum that can swing into where people start saying that people are snowflakes and they can't, deal with stuff and things like that. Because I don't think until it was in the 90s or 2000s that I started hearing more about this term of work-life balance.
Right.
When I was growing up, work-life balance was you worked your 40 hours and then you went to the cabin for the weekend.
Yeah. Well, and I keep looking at how that's changed over the years, even I think there's a generational difference. If I look at my grandfather as an example, who's passed away a few years ago, but he worked super hard, right? He was, he cared about people and they were important, but he was just a very hard worker. He's probably spent a lot of hours, and he was a farmer. He was involved in some other entrepreneurial ventures outside of farming. He worked a lot of hours. I really respect the work ethic that he said. And then I look at my father, very strong work ethic as well, but maybe not quite to the same level as my grandfather had. Maybe my father had a little bit more of that desire to be plugged in with family and
Mhm.
plugged in with some recreational types of things. And some of that relates to the more of those opportunities that were available to him than to my grandfather, just with technology, with something like a television or video games, that kind of thing
Right.
that wasn't available 60, 70 years ago when my
Mm.
grandfather was growing up. And then I look at myself and I still think that I think I work okay. I'm not like a complete slacker, but I don't have the same work ethic as my father. And so I think there is a generational piece that there's lots of factors that contribute to that. Some of it's societal, some of it's cultural, some of it is things like the distractions that we get from phones and computers and all those kind of things that pull us away from being effective. And I think that's only building as the younger generations go on. And I think this next generation, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they're going to have some of the biggest challenges to overcome when it relates to things like technology, specifically with how there's many scientific studies talking about how social media, cell phones are it's changing our brain chemistry. And that's going to impact how they work and how they lead and how they need to be led, which is an interesting challenge.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it comes back to how we're dealing and working with people, right? For me, I'm Generation X. So if it's something important, I want to have a phone call or in person talk about. But, I've led a lot of younger people and they prefer a Slack message or a text message for those types of things sometimes. And that can be frustrating. And as a leader, I've had to learn to adapt to how other people are working. And so that's where I'm steering this with you, Ben, is that this adaptability in leadership. How do you sort of bridge the gap of being too flexible,
Mm.
where you are adapting to your team so much that you end up sort of just becoming a person who's pushing the thing up the hill versus pulling the thing up the hill, I guess? I don't
Right.
know what other metaphor to use there versus like we talked about the hammer and sickle sort of approach from the old days. Like, how do you thread that needle? Because I
Mm.
feel like people have a hard time understanding that balance because they're so worried they're going to be a micromanager.
Right.
And so they'll back way, way off and they stop even being a manager. What's your experience in coaching people through that?
Well, I think that one of the things you said at the beginning there makes a lot of sense. And I think it's been shown to be true. Gallup did the study and they wrote the book called First Break All the Rules, which if any of the listeners here haven't read it yet, fantastic book that really talks about how leaders get the most from their teams. And what the study was, a short
That's the
version.
first book I recommend to anybody who's like,
Yeah.
"What book should I read as a leader?" I'm like, "Read that book first. That's the number
Yeah.
one first book you read."
It's fantastic. And there's lots of good gems in there. But I think one of the gems that I'll highlight in how they talk about it, and they studied thousands of organizations around the world and they looked at the top performing organizations and then they looked at the top performing managers within those organizations. There's certain leaders and certain managers who tend to have teams that are higher functioning and work
Mhm.
better than other teams. And so Gallup studied it and tried to find out what were some of the characteristics of those managers. And one of the key takeaways from that was that the teams that were the most successful had managers who adapted their approach based on the people that were on their teams. Part of that was adapting by understanding their strengths. I'm a Gallup certified Clifton strengths coach, so that's part of the tool, but it's not just understanding strengths, it's understanding what motivates them, what kind of challenges they have, what kind of communication style they respond well to. And I think when I think of adaptability from a leader's perspective, even though that book was written 30 years ago, those principles are still true today, even in our younger generations that we're working with, where we need to understand the people that are on our team. And I think leaders need to make that one of their first things. How do I understand you better, regardless of your age? It's not necessarily adapting in the way that I'm going to give in to everything that you want, but you can change how you communicate with different people based on who they are. Because communication is one of the biggest factors of breakdown in any organization with any ages. How are you going to communicate more effectively? So that's where you adapt in your communication style. And I think one of the things that I encourage a lot of leaders is, regardless of the age of the person, regardless of what their expectations are, how many times are you having conversations with them? Like, let's just whether it's through Slack, even sometimes it's going to be through Slack as an example, but we avoid having those conversations with people because we don't feel ready for it. And so we need to have more conversations with the people on our team, regardless of their age. That's going to help us adapt. And it's also going to help them understand and find that middle ground somewhere where, yeah, you can't get everything that you want. And there is an entitlement challenge that I think is often talked about with the younger generations.
So that's where I want to dive even deeper in with you because I've had these conversations with leaders on my teams before. And there's some people that are very nervous about getting too personal with the
Right.
people on their team. So when you say getting to know them better, some people immediately go like, well, now I have to know like their kids' birthdays and things like
Right.
that. When you say get to know them better and talk to them more, how am I getting to know them better? Where's the line as a leader where I don't want to cross into becoming a friend or even a codependent,
Right.
because that's happened to me before where I've had somebody who's
Yeah.
struggling with the business and I'm their leader, but I'm not the owner of the business. So I
Yeah.
can empathize with some of the struggles they're having because the business is making certain choices and things. And I have to help guide those choices through.
Yeah.
But some of my people might be struggling with them. And so it can become very, very easy for me to sort of end up being in a sort of a codependent place with
Right.
them where they are looking at me as a place to just vent to about problems and things that they're having. What do I do in those situations, Ben? What's your advice
Yeah. And I think the first thing I'll say is that there's no perfect answer, which makes it that much more complicated.
for people?
Yeah. Exactly. Everyone is so unique and everyone is so different and every leader is so different too. So there's no like universal, like follow these 3 steps in how you're going to build that connection or build that relationship or understand that person more effectively. I think though that what I can point to is there is a lot of research that's put around the idea of how vulnerability does play a role in building trust in an organization. And that line of where vulnerability starts and stops or where you should stop it in a lot of ways, that's a gray area. And sometimes leaders listening to this, you might make a mistake on it, right? And you'll learn from it and you might do it the wrong way. Daniel Coyle in his book, The Culture Code, he talks about the vulnerability loop.
Okay.
And most people think trust, which is an important factor in leadership as well, trust is what's required before vulnerability. And he actually talks about it being the other way around.
Hmm.
Vulnerability is the first step. And it becomes a loop where I share something a little bit vulnerably. And it's not like I'm sharing, oh, like, here's my deepest, darkest struggle. And here, let
Right.
me, but it could be something as simple as just, hey, I just had a great weekend. Was at the lake, beautiful. It's fantastic. Talk about the weekend a little bit, right? That, and then I'm
Hmm.
basically opening the door for that loop to start, that vulnerability loop, where then all of a sudden talking to someone else, and they're like, oh yeah, this is what I did on the weekend, and you're starting to build that those small bits of vulnerability that builds towards trust. So that's one
Yep.
piece, Kurt. I think the other piece that I heard you ask about is like that codependency and like making sure that that's not there and like how close do you want to be and it's so tough because I think that leaders shouldn't be scared of building connection and friendship. They don't need to
Hmm.
be best friends. Like that's I think
Right.
one of the things that a lot of people misconstrue where like, oh, I just don't want to be too close to a friend because what happens if I have to fire them or what like, right? It's okay to build relationship. The danger comes when the only part of your connection with them is relationship. Leader
Right.
still needs to lead in other ways too. There still needs to be expectations. There still needs to be accountability. There still needs to be discussions on performance, but we can't ignore that relationships are also still important. So it's all everything together. If you're in balance in one of them, you're probably not leading as effectively as you could. You need to be strong in all of them.
What you just said is that if you are having meetings and you're seeing that most of them are ending up talking about dog walking or something, you're probably not doing your job. You need to have a balance in those conversations and make sure that, to your point, you're talking about performance. Even though that person is more than happy to talk about their weekend and things like, they are concerned about their performance, but they also don't want to be someone that constantly keeps asking about their performance and asking for feedback because they don't want to be that person. And then we can sometimes misinterpret that as that they don't want that feedback or they're not asking and looking for that. And that was a big deal for me early on in my career as a leader and leading teams was understanding that people are not always going to ask for the things that they want
Mm.
because they might just expect them either because of personal experience, previous bosses, or previous jobs where these things were just expected. And if they're not happening, that could send a signal to that person that maybe you don't got your stuff together. You got to
Yeah.
be intentional with your leadership and management in a way that sends a signal that I am here to make sure you are successful. Because as a leader, at the end of the day, we don't do a lot. We just empower our teams to do a lot, right?
Yeah, I mean, I like that word you use, empower, right? I think that's the role. That's the mindset shift that a lot of leaders struggle with between being the classic individual contributor, which especially in any kind of company that is more of a tech company, and then you get promoted into, hey, all of a sudden I'm leading a team. You still might have some individual contributor types of role. Your main role, your mindset shift has to be, my job now isn't just to do my best at my individual contributor stuff. I have to do my best at my team being their best. So what does
Mhm.
that look like?
Yeah, it really does. Like you said, in tech companies, startups, things like that, a lot of promotions happen within, and
Mhm.
there's not a lot of structure around how does that person actually move into a leadership position. There isn't a lot of experience, even from the leadership or the owners of the company, because they probably were a lot of self taught leaders themselves as well. Right. Is that
Well, and
something you run into when you're out coaching? Is a lot of people who aren't classically trained? Yeah.
classically trained. And here's the interesting thing, Kurt. So I think startups, absolutely, that's very true, right? People who kind of homegrown talent, experience, learning things, all those kind of things, right? You figure it out as you go. All of a sudden, if you were a startup where you started on your own or with a small founding team of 3 or 4 people, now you've got a large team and 3 or 4 of the founders or none of them had any experience really being a leader or had any training around being a leader. And now you're leading 50 people or 60 people, or depending on if you hit the unicorn
Yes.
status, right? Could be huge. And, but it's not just startups. It's interesting because even in established organizations, the bigger organizations probably have embedded some sort of leadership training within their organization. But I'm talking about like large or a couple hundred employees and up typically have something. But for sure, in that 0 to 100 to 200 range, it's rare that organizations have any kind of intentional strategy on how to take those leaders and managers that they've identified or that they've promoted and help them become equipped and empowered in their roles to be effective. A lot of it is just like, hey, we needed a manager and you've been in that team for 2 years and now you're a manager. So go for it. What kind of training do you got? You'll figure it out as you go. Right.
Worse, and I've been in this position, you get that promotion and you're driving home and you're like, what the hell am I going to do? You can't say anything to them because if you said something, then make them think they made a poor decision. And you want the more responsibility, you want the more money. You're not going to go to them and be like, hey, where's the training, bro? Like, it's
Yeah.
just not going to
Yeah.
happen. And since you don't ask, that compounds the issue where they don't feel like they need to provide either. So that's exactly like the same situation I was in early on in my career. And I've seen others as well.
Yeah. And it's so common and people don't ask, like you said. And a lot of organizations, because they have so many other things going on already, they know it's important. I wish
Yeah.
I had the statistic in front of me. So I'm going to butcher this statistic, Kurt, but there's a statistic that I read, and it's going to be close to these numbers. Something like 86% of organizations believe that investing in leadership training or management training is valuable for
Mm.
their
Sure.
organization. Yet, only 6% of them have any kind of established strategy to do that.
Yep.
Connect. Even if my numbers were wrong,
No,
someone's
but
listening, they're fact checking me.
live fact checking going on.
Uh,
You see it in security, right? They're all like, oh, 100% of companies say, digital security is important, but less than 20% actually do anything about it. So the idea is that where does a person start with this? So let's get some advice from you, Ben, here. Let's say I am one of those people. I've been promoted and I've been doing this for a little while and I want to get good at it, but I'm struggling. What's your advice? Go out and get a coach, read a book. What should I be doing to keep growing as a new leader? What do
Right.
you find impactful?
It could be all of the above. So I think one of the things
Mhm.
potentially as a first starting point is that maybe you do just need to ask what's available currently in the organization where you've gotten hired or promoted into. What is available for me if I wanted to develop as a leader? I don't think that there's ever going to be a penalty for actually asking that question, because what you're doing is you're communicating that you want to grow, you want to develop, and you want to be more effective. Some organizations have things like that, or at least will provide budget for things like that.
Mhm.
Have anything built in. I think that's a key piece that I talk to a lot of leaders about, is ask questions. Have you asked about what's available? Oh, I haven't really asked. I don't really think there's anything. And
Yeah,
ask,
just the stories they tell themselves, right?
right? And you'd be surprised. Some organizations, now maybe not as many as I'd like there to be, but some organizations have budget just sitting there waiting. And if you just
Yep.
ask, like, they're going to give it to you. And they're going to say typically what they're going to say, Kurt, in those kind of situations, because they probably don't have anything already internally established. A lot of organizations are going to say, what training do you want to take? What do you want to do? Bring me a suggestion, right? So you can go and you can say, hey, I want to do this. It's going to be $1,000. It's going to be $5,000. It's going to be $10,000. And you never know. You might get approved for something that's like $10,000 of training to help you be a better leader. So I think that's a first starting point. The second thing, I believe everyone should have coaching conversations with people, be coached by someone,
Yeah.
and leaders especially. If you are listening to this and you don't have a coach, I mean, I'm biased, of course. I do a lot of coaching. So, you don't need to call me up. Just go talk to someone who's a coach in your area or in your area of expertise, and just have a conversation and ask them what kind of approach they take with coaching. And you'll be surprised how valuable that is. And yeah, books are so cheap and wonderful to be able to learn from. Like,
Yeah, I
pick,
agree.
pick,
And the more you read of them, and this has been my journey, is that the more you read of them, the more you start to take little pieces from column A and a little column B. And then all of a sudden, you've got your sort of unique style and your unique philosophy of things
mhm,
that have worked, things that resonate with you personally. And then as that goes on, I see, and I'm much like yourself, I'm sure, Ben, is that as you build that together, you start to see the value in now turning that train around and providing value back to people on their way up the same path you were. So,
right? We should be
yeah,
looking at not only ways that we can learn from others who are further along from us, or not, and sometimes it's not even that they're further along from us, but it's a different perspective from
yeah,
us. That's
yep,
almost as valuable as just being further along,
yeah.
right? And then
Well,
if
and
we can then turn that around.
as both you and I know, you learn more from teaching than you do. So I always try to get people that are in the leadership positions to try to coach other leaders because you'll learn a lot. I mean, you're always further along than somebody else. So,
Yeah.
and so there's opportunities for that, and you'll learn a lot by giving back that time and that effort. And whether it be with a local high school where you could go and speak to a class,
Mm,
or if it's people in other departments in your business, it doesn't have to be people directly on your team
yeah.
either, where you're providing that value. And it's a great training ground for you to really test some of your philosophy in different situations and with different people. And I've found that to be extremely valuable. It's allowed
Mm.
me to be flexible in the moment, depending on the situation the person's running into and the help that they need. So,
And it's a trend within the world of work right now where coaching, even internally in the organization, is a much better approach than commanding, right? And that's a shift for a
right.
while. So even as leaders, the opportunity for us, if we're being coached by someone, it actually helps us to learn, oh, what would it look like for me to have that coaching conversation with someone on my team? What would it look like for me to ask more questions rather than just tell things? And there's a wonderful book. It's called The Advice Trap by Michael Bungay Stanier. That book is fantastic. He also writes a book called The Coaching Habits, similar books. Both of them are fantastic. Again, anyone listening to this, if you're a leader in an organization, pick up one of those books. The core concept of it is we all have this advice monster that's in our heads,
We
right?
do.
Right? And this advice monster likes to just leap out as soon as there's an opportunity,
Yes.
right? And he takes the approach of, hey, we need to tame the advice monster and ask more questions. And the neuroscience says, and this is what Stanier says, this isn't me, coming up with this. I haven't done this research, but he's done the research and done the reading on it. If you give someone advice, their brain has very to little new triggering in the brain.
Yeah.
if you ask someone a question, new neural activity happens in that moment. And that's what we really want. We want people to build new brain pathways. So learn to ask questions. You're going to have a much better chance of your team actually growing and getting to where you want them to be than if you give them what you think is just the most wonderful advice ever.
Oh yeah. One of the best pieces of advice my father gave me, I was early on in my career and I was complaining that I wasn't getting any feedback on my performance, and because I go to my boss and be like, well, what's your feedback on that last project or whatever? And they're, some version of, work longer hours and take less vacation was the answer. And I remember my father saying, well, you don't want their feedback. You want their advice. You want their knowledge. So go and ask for that. And I
Mhm.
remember going and talking to that same boss and saying, what this last project, like, what would you have done differently
Mhm.
there
Mhm.
or better there? And you could see the entire body language of him change. It really
Right.
opened up. And he was there now to give me all of his advice
Mhm.
back on
Mhm.
how he would have done things and how he would have seen what good looks like and all. It was amazing. And my relationship with that person changed
Yeah.
forever at that moment. And so I give the same advice to young leaders now, is that if you don't want feedback is a waste of time because it's something you can't do anything about, right? It's
Mhm.
past tense. It's something
Mhm.
that's already happened. So, the whole term beating a dead horse sort of thing, right? I'm going to give you feedback. And to your point, I feel like there is that trigger in the brain when you're getting feedback, same as that unsolicited advice trigger, where you're like just ricochets and like it just goes. But
In one ear,
versus going and
out the other.
asking for advice on how would you approach this? How would you solve this problem? And getting that from your boss or leader will really give you not only insight into what good looks like for them, but it will also open up a different door to that vulnerability that you were
Mm.
talking about earlier of them putting themselves in your shoes.
Yeah. Yeah. Huge. And that's where, because as much as the advice monster, I gave it some negative connotations, when you're asking for advice, it actually helps
Yeah.
people feel very honored too, right? Because it's like, now I'm giving you permission to let your advice monster loose. I want to hear it.
Yes. No, that's the difference between solicited and unsolicited
Yep.
advice, right?
Exactly.
I tell people
Exactly.
all the time, they're like, well, people don't want advice. And I'm like, not unsolicited advice, but if you go and solicit the advice, that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And I do the same even when I'm coaching people. I work with a lot of people in transition. And one of my first things is to look over their LinkedIn profile. But I always ask, I'm like, do you want me? I could go through and give you some advice on your LinkedIn profile. Do you want it? And they always say yes. But I always feel like I have to
Mm.
ask for that permission up front, not because it's needed, but it sets the expectations of the conversation that I'm not talking down to you. I'm trying to help because it can come across as a leader when you're giving that advice, if it's unsolicited, that you're talking down to someone, right?
Yes. Yes.
No.
I haven't
And
found anyone yet who likes it.
all right, Ben, the last thing I want to touch on here though is that what are some of the challenges in today's world and our sort of pseudo dystopian world that we're living in that you're seeing that leaders are struggling with these days, and what's some of your advice for people during the current days that we're in?
Yeah. And that's a great question because, especially with the last couple of years, right? There's been a lot of divisiveness within the world. People seem to be pulling further and further apart on things like politics or other issues. There's
Mhm.
lots of doom and gloom conversation around the economic times and some of those challenges. We're seeing some of the greatest rates of mental health challenges, depression and anxiety, stress, burnout, all those things are moving further and further up. And then you combine that with a lot of the challenges and changes that have been happening with the world of technology, like artificial intelligence is soon going to, you know, take over everything, whatever the case might be. Maybe not everything, but lots of things. And I think it provides a lot of uncertainty, right? And then we talked a little bit earlier about the role of social media and our devices on mental health, new ways our brains are being developed. And I think, yeah, leaders, a lot of leaders are feeling that tension about how do I navigate this with my teams? And I think one of the things, if there's probably two pieces of advice I would give to leaders. One is that leaders have to be really good at navigating the things they need for their own positive, hopeful viewpoint in life, right? We need to be good at, we know the things we need to do, right? Eat right, exercise, get the sleep we need. Like if you did those three things alone, that would probably mitigate a lot of the ways that we are impacted by the things around us already. And we know that, right? We just don't often do that. So that would be one piece of encouragement, to do those things that you need to do in order to be in a good, healthy place. I think
There's a
this,
reason why in an airplane, when the masks drop, they want you to put it on yourself first and then help
yes,
other people.
it's a great
Because if you're not
analogy.
cognizant, if you're not aware, you can't help other people, right?
Yeah. And so much, it's interesting when I do leadership coaching, a lot of what I coach around with leadership development and leadership coaching ends up being around those types of things about taking care
Mhm.
of yourself first. Now, I'm not saying, like, don't don't work long hours. So, sure, a lot of leaders work long hours. They naturally do because they like working long hours or they feel they have to. And maybe we talk about that and we try to navigate that and maybe mitigate some of that. But outside of those long hours, what are the other things that you're doing? If all we're doing is going home, flipping on Netflix, sitting on the couch, having a few cold ones, none of those things are bad in and of themselves. But if that's what we're doing every day at the end of the day, and that's how we're trying to release the stress and the pressure and try to be hopeful, we're not going to be the hope-filled leaders that can make a difference. Right. So I think that would be the first piece of advice. And the second piece, I use the word hope-filled. And I think leaders need to develop that skill of hope, pointing others towards hopefulness in this world. Maybe it's a little bit, what's the all roses and lollipops I'm trying to promote here? Maybe I'm a little bit naive, but I think in spite of that, me being a little bit naive, I think there's some truth there where we can be leaders who bring that hope. And if we can do that, we're going to make our teams feel better about where they're at. And ultimately, we're going to leave a little bit of a legacy with those people we've been leading where, hey, remember when I worked for Kurt? That was so good to work for Kurt. I wish I could still be working for Kurt. Wouldn't that be great to hear?
I love it. I love it, Ben. Well, Ben, I hope that you come back on the show again sooner. We can't have such a break this next time.
Yeah.
And can you share with the audience if they want to follow you? Just so you all know out there, Ben puts out great content on LinkedIn. Make sure you follow him there. Where else can I find you and learn more about the work you do?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is a really great place to start. You can find me on there. Ben Dueck, Dueck is the last name. You can just Google that. You'll find my smiling face on the Google profiles. You can connect with me. I would love if you were listening to this, even when you connect, to say, hey, I was listening to the Schmidt List and this is where I heard about you. That's fantastic. I do have a website. It needs some updating, Kurt. I know I'm probably going to get a million from all your followers that do web development. They're going to reach out to me now and say, hey, I can
Yeah,
help you with
okay.
your website. But Cantera Leadership is my company name. Cantera leadership.com is my website. You can check that out there. But LinkedIn really is the best place to reach out. And in case anyone didn't hear it in my accent, I am Canadian as well. So any of your listeners that caught on to that, but hey, I've got friends all over.
That's great. Well, thanks so much, Ben. I always enjoy our conversations. I appreciate the work you're doing.
Thanks for having me on, Kurt. Always love chatting leadership with you.
Thanks, Ben. All right, everyone. Thanks for taking the time out of your week to join me and Ben. Isn't that great? Like I'm telling you, go to LinkedIn, follow Ben. He puts out great content around leadership and he's always open for a conversation. So hit him up, talk to him, tell him about the things that you're interested in. He's more than happy to chat with folks. We'll see you next time.
You